Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our lower control arm. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension is hanging. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now with the wheel off of there, let's continue on to removing our front sway bar link. Now to do this, looking up along the top, you're going to find a 14mm nut. Follow that all the way down underneath the control arm and you'll find a 14mm headed bolt that goes all the way up through this. Let's go ahead and hold on to one side with a wrench and the other side with our air gun and go ahead and remove it. Let's take this apart. We've got our top nut. We've got our top washer. Underneath that, you have one of these bushings. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and drive this down and out of here. Just be very careful not to damage the threads if you're planning on reusing your original sway bar link. All right, now as I start pulling down this bolt, I'm going to go ahead and hold on to all of the center pieces here because they're all separate pieces. Pop them right out of there. I'll show you how to put all this back together when we go for the reinstallation process. Now from underneath this area, we're going to go ahead and pay attention to that lower ball joint nut. You can see that that nut is fairly close to the axle boot. You want to be very careful when you're removing this not to damage that axle boot in any way. To remove this lower ball joint nut, we're going to use an 18mm wrench. Go ahead and put it on here, turn it counterclockwise to remove it. All right, so at this point it's as loose as it's going to get while the axle is still in that position, so we're just going to continue on with a pickle fork and we'll go ahead and break this free. Let's go ahead and use our pickle fork and our hammer. Once it's separated, you should be able to see this move up and down. Now we're just going to carefully pry down on this, making sure we don't get our fingers in a pinch point, and go ahead and finish off removing that nut. Go ahead and set that aside. Now we're going to pay attention to the areas that the control arm mounts onto your subframe. You're going to have a forward mounting bolt right here that goes straight on through from the front to the rear. And then looking a little bit further back, you'll have another 18mm headed bolt that goes from the front to the back as well. Now on the back side of each of these there is a nut, but that's actually kind of a captured nut, so you don't necessarily have to worry about holding that, but we will have to gain access to this. Typically for this shield, there should be a push clip right in this area. Just go ahead and pop that right out of there so you can lift this up and out of the way. After that, you have access to your mounting bolt. There's that nut from the back side. We'll leave this bolt in here and continue on to the rear. Let's make our way to the back bolt now. There's that nut, same as the first. Now we can start removing both of our bolts. When we do this, we want to be very careful. What I want to do is go ahead and pull down on this control arm a little bit. Like that, so I'm dislodging it from the knuckle. This part's super important because we need to pull this out. If you pulled this out without removing that first, you could put a tug on your axle and you're going to have to buy yourself an axle more than likely. Now that I have this moving around, I can go ahead and start removing both of my mounting bolts. There's one. When you get it out of there, just go ahead and inspect those threads. Make sure they look good. We'll clean them up later. See if I can get this one out of here. That one looks good as well. remove your control arm. Now the next thing that you're going to want to do with the control arm out is to clean and inspect all the mounting areas. You have the front area on the subframe, the rearward area on the subframe, and of course the area on the knuckle that the ball joint is supposed to go up and into. Go ahead and wipe it all down and give it a good inspection. Once that's cleaned up well enough, let's go ahead and clean up our bolts and apply a little bit of red thread locker to the very end of the threads. Okay, those are looking a lot better. Let's go ahead and grab our brand new control arm. Slide that up and into position in the frame there. Sometimes you just have to give it a loving bonk with a rubber mallet just to drive it into position. Now we're just going to line up our forward bolt hole. We can start in that mounting bolt. Looking at your two bolts, you're going to notice that they're different lengths. The bolt that's longer is for the front bolt. Okay, that one started. Now we can do the rearward bolt, which is the shorter of the two. Just lined up. Now we can start on each of our mounting nuts. Now with both of those bolts started, let's go ahead and put the lower ball joint into the knuckle. Just going to get this lined up, wiggle it around a little bit. Press that up and in. Now we can take our brand new ball joint nut. We're going to start that on there before we put it up too high. All right, now the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and apply some pressure underneath this area of the control arm. You want to be very careful because you can see this is at an angle and you don't want your jack to slip and potentially hurt anybody. But what we need to do is raise this up so it's essentially in the ride height position so we can continue tightening the rest of our bolts. When you do this, be very careful not to put it on your ball joint. Now let's go ahead and bottom out both of these bolts and then we'll torque each of them to manufacturer specification. Torque each of these bolts to 117 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to tightening up our ball joint nut. Now for this, as you can tell, it's going to be fairly hard to fit a socket and a torque wrench in here, but if you could, you would want to torque this nut to 89 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and make it nice and tight. Now once you feel as though you have it tight, the next thing that you're going to want to do is go ahead and line up the slot of the ball joint nut with the hole that goes through the ball joint stud. If it doesn't look like it's lined up, you need to continue tightening that nut until the very next slot does. All right, so looking at this ball joint, it looks as though I've got the nut, so it's pretty much lined up. I'm going to go just a teeny bit more here, and we'll slide that cotter pin right on through to lock it down. So there's our locking cotter pin. I'm going to go ahead and slide it through. Now once it comes through, you're going to want to go ahead and peen over those ears so it can't come loose on you. Generally, I try to put these up and over the top. You just want to be very careful to make sure it doesn't hit up against that axle. Now you can go ahead and lower the jack so the control arm comes down. Now before we go ahead and get out from underneath this area, the next area that you're going to pay attention to is the bottom of the ball joint. Looking at it, you can see a threaded hole. In that package, it came with a grease fitting. You're going to have to go ahead and use a 7mm to install this. Generally, I just take it, start it in by hand, and then I'll snug it up with a 7mm in my ratchet. Let's go ahead and fill this up with grease. What we're watching for is that boot up there to start to expand. All right, I'm going to give it a little push. I can feel that it's bubbling out. I don't need to continue greasing it until grease comes pouring out and gets on the rotor. That looks pretty good. Wipe down your mess. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and start reinstalling our sway bar link. Now if you were to look at this, you can see that I have one of my washers here on the bottom of the bolt, and then I have one of my bushings. If you were to look at the top of that bushing, you can see it has that little dimple on there. Essentially, you want to make sure that that dimple is facing up towards where the control arm is. So what we would do is just go ahead and start putting this up and through like this. And now we're going to take another one of those rubber bushings, and we want to have that dimple facing down now, facing towards that control arm. Now we can put on one of our washers facing towards that bushing. Put on your shaft spacer. After you have that on there, go ahead and put on another one of your washers. And then another one of your bushings. The bushing is going to be facing up this time, facing towards that sway bar. Now we're going to have to go ahead and slide this into position. If it looks like it's too tight, you can try using a pry bar in this area to try to raise up the sway bar just a tiny bit. There we are. Now that I have that lined up, I'm going to try to push that bolt up and through. Time for another bushing with the dimple facing down towards the sway bar. Metal washer, and then it's time for your nut. Go ahead and start that on by hand. If you find that you don't have enough thread on that stud to start your nut on there, just carefully get in between your tie rod and the sway bar and gently pry it down just enough to get some threads. Now let's go ahead and use our 14 millimeters again, one on top, one along the bottom here, and we're going to start tightening this up. When you tighten it, you want to just make sure that the bushings are touching up against the control arm and the sway bar right here. Essentially just make it so they're making contact, but not necessarily pancaked so they're flat. Now, as you can tell, my bushings are touching up against the control arm perfectly, and they're also up against that sway bar. This looks perfect. Now we can go ahead and get the wheel up on here. At this point, we're going to start on all 5 of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of these lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, we can go ahead and torque these. Torqued. Okay friends, we got our control arm in there. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to go ahead and take this for a road test. Make sure you don't hear any funny noises. After that, get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.